Hello and welcome. Tonight we're speaking about the Post-Carbon Institute. With me is Ashur Miller, the director of the Institute. Ashur, hello, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, appreciate it.
Well, I wanted to start with the Institute's founding and how you came to be.
Sure. Post-Carbon Institute was founded actually in 2003 in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it was founded by a husband and wife who were concerned about sustainability issues, but then really got turned on to peak oil as an issue primarily. And then they moved the organization down to the Bay Area, actually to the North Bay, to Sebastopol in 2006, the end of 2006. And the organization's been in the North Bay ever since, but our fellows are spread all over. We've got fellows all over the US, and we actually have some fellows in Australia and England and elsewhere. So we're sort of an international organization that has its roots now in the Bay Area.
And you hit on a lot of issues, which you focus on peak oil.
Yeah, peak oil, I think, has been a central focus for the organization from the early days, but I would say that we're more of a, if you want to call it, a peak everything organization. Richard Heinberg, who's our senior fellow, actually wrote a book called Peak Everything a few years ago. And our work is really looking at the intersection of a number of issues that we're dealing with. We have the unfortunate, circumstance, I think, right now where we're dealing with not just one crisis, but actually a multitude of crises that we have to sort of look at, not only concurrently, but look at how they actually influence one another. So we try to take a sort of a systemic view of these issues. So yes, energy issues and constraints around energy is a core focus for us. Primarily, I think, because we feel that energy and the discovery and use of fossil fuels has really been the driving force behind certainly the world that we know today, but also changes that are occurring within the energy system are going to ripple out and have a lot of profound impacts on other systems that we rely upon, our food system, healthcare, trade, all kinds of things. But we also look at things like public health issues and sustainability around that. We look at food systems, in and of themselves, transportation, the whole range of issues. We even have one fellow who's a neuroscientist who looks at human evolutionary behavior and why we make decisions the way we do, and wrote a book called American Mania, which is really about what drives us to consume and need ever more things, to fill our lives.
So peak oil means also peak food, and it's interesting to think of peak oil as a summit that we are on top of, that are hitting the maximum amount of oil that we can pull out of the planet easily. Means that we've also we're at a summit of in our use of oil in everything that we do in our food, but in our products also, and that we have to descend from the summit. That we need a post-carbon world, and we need to think about a post-carbon world. And one way or another, we're going to be in a post-carbon world in 50 or 100 years, and we can do that gently, or we can do that in a rough way.
Yeah, I think the way we view it is that we're actually experiencing a transition right now from a world that has been really a story of exponential growth, an exponential growth of human beings on this planet, population. We're now at 7 billion people and growing. Exponential growth in terms of economic activity, exponential growth in terms of our consumption of resources, and energy just being one of those resources. And so we've been on this kind of crazy ride for the last couple hundred years, and we're going through a transition, in that trajectory. We're bumping up against limits, energy being one very key limit, but there are other limits. Like, for example, the climate change, which is really the limit of the atmosphere's ability to handle the emissions that we're putting out into the planet. And so the question I think that we're faced with is not should we transition, should we have a post-carbon world, should we live more sustainably, but really how will we manage that transition? And I think that that's a reality that people are starting to wake up to. I think that,
but not fast enough.
Perhaps not fast enough. Although it's unfortunate that it takes these things, but events like Hurricane Sandy, hitting the eastern seaboard, just a very short period of time, after another hurricane had hit that area, massive drought has spread across this country. I mean, people sense that around climate, I think that we're seeing impacts right now. I mean, I don't know what the last poll was, but it's somewhere around 80% of Americans really recognize that climate change is a real threat. Now, does that translate into direct action? Does it translate into meaningful legislation on the national, international level? Does it translate into people really significantly changing their behavior? It hasn't, obviously. Right now, as we're speaking, there's the climate summit that they do every year is COP18 this time, and they're doing it in Qatar. But you're not hearing very much about it in the news. In fact, I haven't heard very many environmental activists talking about it because there's just really no traction there. I think that, so on the one hand, no, we're not acting fast enough, though the evidence continues to mount, and I think that people are increasingly recognizing that this is a significant and severe threat. But when you look at it on the local level, I think there are a lot of communities who cannot put a bubble around their community and protect themselves from climate change, but are recognizing that they need to sort of take these matters into their own hands. And it'll be a really interesting test, I think, for a community like New York City to think about how they rebuild after an event like this, recognizing that these kinds of catastrophic weather events are more likely to happen in the future. Do they rebuild, the way that New York had been before, or do they think about building differently? And so the more and more people are experiencing these kinds of shocks, I think the more people recognize that we are not dealing with business as usual anymore. So we're in that transition, and then the question is, how do we manage that? And a big part of our work is to try to help people understand the true nature of the challenges that we're dealing with, and that unfortunately they're not easy answers, but there are things that we can do to be responding to these things.
You focus on publications, and you have a number of good publications. You also co-author publications with other groups like the IFG, the International Forum on Globalization.
Sure, yeah. Publications are certainly one of the ways that we try to help build awareness and educate people. So we've been publishing books, regularly every year. We do publish reports. We're actually working on a report right now, looking very critically in a lot of detail at the shale gas, quote unquote, revolution that we're all hearing about, and also looking at shale oil, which not a lot of people are aware of, but there's been an increase in production of shale oil or tight oil, primarily in the Bakken area and in the western states. And we're hearing the International Energy Agency just last week came out with a report claiming that the United States is going to pass Saudi Arabia as the world's biggest oil producer, by 2020. And so we're doing a report to kind of look very critically at, is this true? Will we be able to, increase our energy independence or energy security through these domestic resources, shale gas and shale oil? And
the net energy.
Well, net energy is a big issue, and it's something that a lot of people are not aware of.
Yes.
So if you think about, talking about peak oil, so the story of oil in very simple terms is that the United States used to be the world's biggest oil producer by far. It was actually the world's biggest oil exporter. We were, we still are, in the top 3 in the world right now, but the picture of oil production has changed pretty significantly. Everybody has that picture of the Beverly Hillbillies in their mind. You drill and then you get this huge, blowout, and suddenly you're rich. And for some people, that was what the oil discovery stage was like. Oil production now in the U.S. is a very different picture. When we had the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago, what we didn't hear a lot of talk about was what I think is a very simple question, and that is, why were we drilling down 18,000 feet in the first place? And that is because the cheap and easy stuff, has basically been picked. And that means that the energy resources that we have go after now are of lower quality, they're harder to get to, and we have to exert a lot more effort, a lot more capital, and a lot more energy to actually get energy out. And that's what the concept of net energy is. In early days, a net energy of oil production was 100 plus to 1, which means that for every barrel of oil we had to put in, we would get 100 barrels out. And that's the reason why we had the happy motoring era that we did in the United States. We built a highway system, we built the sprawling suburbs, because we had an abundance of this stuff, and just the sheer amount of energy wealth that we got was so tremendous. But now it's much lower than that. When you look at things like tar sands, which is something that is an increasing concern, particularly for climate activists and others concerned about the environmental impacts, the energy return on energy invested of tar sands is very low. It's
1 to 3?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it's estimates vary, but it's magnitudes lower than the energy return that we used to get. And that is, in a nutshell, is the story of peak oil. The concept of peak oil is really when you hit, as you said, maximum production, and then you are at that top and decline. We've been on a plateau now in terms of world production, for the last half decade, a little bit longer. And the oil industry is doing everything they can to go after these more marginal, harder to get plays to keep production up. But that's in the face of a lot of depletion, of existing wells, and a lot of these new wells, especially tight oil wells, they deplete very rapidly, and. So yeah, we're in a pickle. We're in a pickle because we shouldn't be burning this stuff because of the carbon that gets emitted into the atmosphere is just going to wreak ever more havoc. And we cannot keep burning this stuff the way that we've been burning it.
We need to start leaving it in the ground.
Yeah, but the thing that I think people have to understand is that we've built this entire world based upon those energy resources, and it's been an investment of trillions of dollars and decades and decades and decades. And so transitioning away from fossil fuels is not a plug and play type of switch. You can't unplug coal or unplug oil particular, because oil is a very difficult thing to substitute in terms of other liquid fuels. You can't just unplug those things out and swap in, ethanol.
Renewables.
Yeah.
On that topic, Richard Heinberg authored what I thought was a great paper, Searching for a Miracle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he focused on net energy out of all these various alternative energies, and saying there's no way that we can replace all the energy we get from fossil fuels with any combination of hydro and solar and what have you.
Yeah, and that's the thing about energy, is that energy there's different qualities to these things. You have to look in Searching for a Miracle, you sort of did an analysis of, I think it was 18 different energy resources around 10 different criteria, and those criteria have to do with things like, the distribution of that, the location of it, the environmental impacts, the energy return on energy invested. And like I said, oil, for example, very easy to transport, very energy dense. There are just certain characteristics about it. We didn't have to put in all the effort to actually, nature did this for us, over millions and millions of years. Our effort has been to extract it out of the ground.
How many man hours in a barrel?
Oh, in a barrel, it's the equivalent of about $500,000 worth of human labor.
Right.
And if you pay someone $20 an hour working full time, it's just an immense amount. We complain about gas prices, but a gallon of gasoline is the equivalent of about 6 weeks or so of hard human labor. And so we can rail against the fossil fuel industry, and there's lots of things to rail against, and particularly the way that they have made very concerted efforts to block significant policies to address climate change and the promotion of renewable energy. But at the end of the day, we're the ones that are addicted to this stuff, and we really need to look at our own use and think about reducing our consumption, frankly, because as you just said, we don't see any viable scenario where we're going to be able to continue on this trajectory that we've been on in terms of ever increasing consumption of energy. And we can't forget, a lot of people in the rest of the world, China, India, other places, and developing nations that want to have the same standard of living that we have, and the Earth can simply not sustain that for a lot of reasons, but there's not enough fossil fuel energy or renewable energy to go around to be able to allow that to happen. So we have to really look at that. And so we promote relocalization as a strategy, which means communities thinking about how they could, and this is a strategy both to reduce our dependence and our impacts on the environment and the climate, but also to mitigate against scarcity and shocks to the energy system. So relocalization is a strategy to try to source as much of our food from local sources, our energy, and other services and goods. So we have been publishing a series of books that sort of look at ways that people are doing that. When you look at the situation that we're in, and we write it and talk a lot about this stuff, you can get very despondent about the pickle that we're in. The one area that I feel a lot of hope is when I look out there in the landscape of people working very hard in places like Berkeley, to take matters into their own hands, and they're doing it with a lot of hard work and creativity. And do those scale? Right now, they don't scale. These efforts are still pretty marginal. I mean, organic food is what, 4% or something like that of the food system, and that's with a lot of investment and a lot of awareness. But these are important places to start, and certainly the place that individuals like us can start. So we really are trying to help people recognize sort of the most promising models that are out there. And we emphasize community scale because we don't think that it's very viable for people to sort of hunker down, board up their houses, or head for the hills and try to withstand the shocks that we're going to be dealing with on their own. We need to do this as communities.
We were talking about relocalization, and I thought I might ask you about transition towns.
Sure. So transition towns is one approach that people are taking, again, on the community scale, to transition their communities away from fossil fuels. And the transition movement started in the UK. It was started by a man named Rob Hopkins, who's one of our fellows, who worked with some students first in Kinsale, Ireland, to sort of look at how could they develop a plan for how they would really drastically reduce the community's dependence and use of fossil fuels. And then he ended up relocating to a town in England called Totnes, and instituted this process and developed basically a whole methodology and approach for how community can engage its members in this process, with the goal of ultimately developing what they called an energy descent action plan. But the process, I think, has been, and the model has been a real inspiration to people, and has been picked up. I'm not even sure how many countries it's in now, probably a couple dozen countries. And in the U.S. now, probably 120 or so transition towns have started. I think the part of the appeal for the transition of the transition movement is that it's very participatory. The belief in transition at its heart is that the future can be better without fossil fuels. It doesn't have to be a deficit focus. It doesn't have to be driven by fear. It can be driven by a belief that if you unleash the creativity of the people in the community and really tap the assets that exist within that community, that these communities can create a future that's better than the one we have right now. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that greater consumption of resources and kind of the rat race, that we are surrounded by, are not necessarily, fulfilling people or making people happy. I think that a lot of people, it was interesting, there was an article actually in Elle magazine of all places a couple of years ago about the transition movement. And I spoke with a woman who wrote it. She was just talking about her own experience of getting familiar with transition. And I spoke to her afterwards just to get her sense of what the reaction was, right? Because L readers, these are women who are reading about fashion and all these kinds of things, might not necessarily be your typical, transitioner types. And so I was curious, and she said they got a really very strong reaction and response from people. And the thing that people responded to was not about climate change or peak oil, which are the sort of the two pillars that transition, the transition movement is trying to respond to. It wasn't about that. It was about the fact that they were really intrigued by this idea of building community. And I think people are really feeling a loss of community, and transition provides that for people. And so transition now in the United States is in, I think, something like 30-something states. I'm not sure how many states it's in.
You're involved, aren't you, in the U.S. effort?
Yeah, so we have a national hub that's actually based here in Northern California, and I'm involved with that organization. Post Carbon Institute, we actually had a program that was called the Relocalization Network that I actually ran when I started at Post Carbon Institute in 2008. And at the time when we started it, there wasn't anything like that, and it started very organically because our founders were going around and talking about peak oil and talking about climate change, and people were asking what they could do, and we were promoting the idea of relocalization. So there were groups that just sort of naturally formed to try to think about how to tackle these issues, and so we were providing support for those groups. And then when transition emerged, again, first in the UK, and then Rob wrote a book called The Transition Handbook, and we were hearing actually from members of the Relocalization Network and others that they were really inspired by this model, felt like it was something that is sort of a template that they could use, that we felt that it was better for us to sort of throw our support behind that emerging movement here in the United States than to have a separate network. So we actually provided funding and try to help sort of get the U.S. movement sort of off the ground.
So how does a town start to be a transition town?
Usually they go through what's called a mulling phase. So there's, in the U.S., as I mentioned, there are probably 120 or so official transition initiatives, but they're double that in terms of communities that are mulling. And again, these are driven by people who hear about transition from one way or another, from friends in other communities, from film screenings or whatever it is that draws them, to transition. And usually what happens is they initiate some events. They reach out to people, explore some of these topics to see if there's any energy within the community to try to develop this thing. And then an initiating group is formed, which is usually a core group of members that say, and again, these are all volunteers, people doing this on, kind of on top of their regular lives, but come together to, think about, okay, how do we first build awareness? And I think most transition initiatives focus on that first. They focus on doing events to build awareness about these issues, to promote the transition model, and try to create enough energy and excitement in the community to eventually do what's called a great unleashing, which is usually a public event, really to say, here, we've arrived, we've got this new transition initiative formed here. And then eventually there are working groups that are formed. Different transition initiatives take a different form, and there's not kind of a to Z sort of blueprint for it, but oftentimes
is there some structure that they can
I think,
plug into?
Yeah, I mean, the transition, like I said, the transition network, Transition US and Transition Network in the UK have developed tons of resources for people. So there are things that they can actually implement, in terms of project ideas. And there's also a lot of resources in terms of following the steps they're not really called steps anymore, they're sort of ingredients, things around building awareness, the formation of working groups, doing a great unleashing, these kinds of things. So there's activities I would say a lot of the transition initiatives have kind of followed and replicated in their own communities. But I would say for the most part, transition is a very, very young movement, and transition initiatives, again, they're very grassroots, they're bottom up, and they're driven by the energy and the talents of the people that get together, So they're in various states, in terms of how far they've come and what their focus is. A lot of them focus on food as kind of a primary way of getting people engaged, and it's also something that's very tactile and is a great community builder. So we've seen a lot of food projects, springing up from Transition.
Is visibility a problem sometimes for them?
Sure. I mean, it's always a problem, and it depends again on the community that you're in, So, and they face different issues. I mean, so there's a Transition Berkeley, and I think I don't know. I don't want to speak for them, but I think that Transition Berkeley is dealing with a different reality than a group like Transition Sandpoint, Idaho, which is that Berkeley has, wonderfully a real rich community of environmentalists, organizations, other grassroots groups working on these issues. So there's a rich landscape of people doing sustainability work, and so for Transition to come in a community like Berkeley, I would think it's more about being a convener than it is about recreating something from scratch. Whereas a community like Transition Sandpoint has a lot, in some ways, an easier, playing field to work on because, they're kind of the first game in town, let's say. But they also have to do a lot more legwork in terms of just education and awareness and those kinds of things, So the issues that vary, and there's Transition in Los Angeles. That's a much different animal. That's a huge metropolitan area,
right?
And so their challenges are very different, So it's kind of hard to say that there's a one pattern that's emerged for all of them.
Sure. Does this also feed into the food sovereignty movement?
It does. I mean, food sovereignty is something that I would say local food is something that a lot of people have been gravitating towards for a number of reasons. Some people are focused on food sovereignty because of social justice issues, and some people have focused on it because of a concern about energy and peak oil and the reliance on the food system to fossil fuel inputs or climate change. So people are coming to it from a lot of different perspectives. A lot of people are focused on it from a health perspective, Yes, I mean, I think people are coming to this kind of work for different reasons. And I think part of our work at Post Carbon Institute, and I think Transition tries to do this a little bit as well, and that is to play on the passions of the people and the motivations of the people, what's driving them, to act, but then trying to connect that, into a more systemic understanding of issues and connecting the dots so that strategies are really looking at the interplay between things. Water and food, water, food, and energy, local jobs. How does that relate to local food systems? How do we ensure that we can get young farmers who we desperately need to be able to earn a living wage, doing this work? Can they get land? Those kinds of issues, So they all sort of come together, and I think what's really needed is people to be connecting those dots.
Good. Well, sure, we have about a minute left. If someone's watching the show and they want to help the Post Carbon Institute, how can they do that? Your website? Do you take donations?
Sure. Yeah, our website is postcarbon.org. Yes. I would also suggest that people check out a website we just launched called resilience.org, which has a huge archive of articles, really insightful essays that we post, new ones every day, but also has a directory of groups working all over the U.S. and abroad on these issues. And a lot of resources that we've been pulling together in terms of how people can go and actually build community resilience. So I'd definitely suggest people go to resilience.org.
Good. Very good. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you very much for your work.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. And thank you for watching. Good night.